I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet today, or at least I'm broadcasting from, which for me are the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present, which feels like an especially important thing to do this week or in this moment. But before we get to the topic at hand, I guess there's a few kind of fundamentals that I wanted to cover as well. So firstly, I wanted to say my name's Daniel Stone. I'm the Executive Director of Principal Co, which is a progressive advocacy and campaigns organisation that does a lot of work with organisations to make them a bit more effective and impactful. When COVID first started, as long as that was ago, I can't even remember when, how many weeks it's been, a number of organisations came together to kind of create Australia at Home. These include The Guardian, the Centre for Australian Progress, Essential Media, Community Council for Australia, and the Australian Climate Foundation. The hope was to basically create a space where we could think about bigger ideas than just the immediate stresses that we were all facing at that time. And I think that although the pressure and the stress of COVID has dissipated a little bit, I think it's still a really useful forum, given that so many other things have started to come to light, noticeably the Black Lives Matter movement from the US and then the Australian version of that as well, really capturing our attention over the last few weeks. We are ending the series next week, so this will be my last session. Thank you to everyone who has joined us over the last many weeks. I think it's really helped me get through this time, and I really hope it's helped you as well. Do have a look at australiahome.com.au where you can see all of the sessions we've done previously. There's a lot of really, really interesting conversations there, and check out australiahome.com.au to see what we've got on next week for our kind of last run. A couple of quick ground rules. We're recording this session to share later so that people can go back and look at it. Do let us know, either myself or Hannah, in the chat if there's an issue with that. We're also going to keep everybody on mute just so there's not a whole bunch of background noise. We will unmute some people when they come forward to do the Q&A a bit later on in our chat, but that's where we're going to start at. But in the meantime, please do use the chat function. Put any questions, thoughts, reflections you've got in there. We will try and call people forward to kind of engage, and we do want people to share a rich discussion that kind of answers some of the questions that people have had on their mind. So please do jump in there and do that. Today, I'm sure you've been reading a lot and thinking a lot about what brings us here today. We're joined by a great group of women who will help us explore that, notably Carly Warner, who's the CEO of the ALS New South Wales ACT, and also Larissa Baldwin, who's the First Nations Justice campaigner at GetUp. But before we turn to that discussion, I wanted to ask both of you, Carly and Larissa, which is a question which we've asked everybody at Australia at Home so far. How have you been going, and how have you been feeling in these tumultuous times? There's clearly a lot of things to occupy your mind, and I might start with you, Carly. How have you been feeling?
Thanks, Daniel, and I acknowledge that I'm in Gadigal and Mongol land today and off country. It's a large question, isn't it, in relation to how I've been feeling for the last few months. I actually don't really know how to describe it. I've worked from home for 2.5 years for a period before, and so well used to kind of being withdrawn from people. But I think no matter how much I was used to that, I've still absolutely missed the energy that you can only get from humans being face to face. We have obviously had quite a lot of work to do with a workforce of over 200 people during that time, and making sure that, you know, everyone is safe and well, which has kept me particularly busy. But I've lost track really of the sense of time, I have to say. Even talking to people and hearing about things that happened last month feel like it was years ago for me. And you know, the things that are happening at the moment are all huge and are requiring a lot of energy and sustained energy.
Yeah, absolutely. And Larissa, how about yourself?
I think it's just, 2020 as a campaigner, like I'm up, at the moment I'm on Jagera and Turrbal country up here in Brisbane, but, and like to acknowledge country here. but I feel like that this year it's intense for a lot of different reasons. We're trying to think about like people saying this is the worst year ever and that sort of stuff. And I was thinking about it, we were talking the other day and saying like 2020 is kind of redefined as the year that people talk about individualism and that sort of stuff, but it kind of redefined in terms of like that, how much we need each other. And so I was thinking about even in terms as a campaigner, like not really knowing how to campaign in different moments and that. And a lot of our work in the First Nations team has shifted into, well, how do we support? Can we change the narrative? Can we elevate work that other people are doing and that sort of stuff? But it has been intense and it's just like one thing after the other. And I feel like everyone feels a little bit like that as well.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a pretty, those two themes are pretty universal from what I've been hearing from people as well, is like a lot of things and also a complete loss of a sense of our time. I think to like throw to, normally I start off these sessions with a bit of a like overview to set the tone, but I actually, a video that the two of you pulled together does that better than I think I could. And I may just play that for everybody now. So if you give me a moment, I'll share that and you can all watch. Actually, let me.
Another Aboriginal death in custody, it's only a matter of time before this occurs again.
They really don't care about our people inside jails.
Aboriginal Australians are dying in all our jails.
More than 400 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have died in custody since the end of the Royal Commission.
They're not safe in there, they never have been and they never will be.
I'm Latoya Aroharu. My family descend from Wiradjuri and Māori, Ngāti Porou in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and from Sydney, but I've grown up on Kaurna land for the last 27 years here in Adelaide, South Australia.
My name is Michaela Reynolds. My mob is Kamilaroi, but I currently live on Gadigal land. Growing up, my brother Nathan was the eldest sibling. He would always bring me, like, when I was a kid, a milk-top Freddo frog home from work every day nearly. This is exactly how I remember him, full of life. His daughter was his world.
Wayne was a father, fisherman and an artist. That's Wayne. One of my brother Wayne's most unique qualities, I think, was his sense of peace. He taught me a lot about how to be still, independent, and I guess exist comfortably. Yeah.
In September 2018, my brother Nathan passed away in a New South Wales Correctional Centre, basically due to neglect. He had an asthma attack. It took 40 minutes for the first point of medical help to arrive, and at that time it was too late. My auntie rang at 6 a.m. I answered the phone and that's when I was told about Nathan's passing. I was numb and in disbelief. It was the worst day of my life.
My brother was pinned down by more than 14 officers with a spit hood over his head, cuffed with his wrists and his feet, and put in the back of a transport van with more than 7 officers. He was taken out unconscious. I was with Wayne at the time when we turned off the life support machines, so I was watching him as that occurred, watching his heart slow as it did.
I feel like a piece of me left when I lost Nathan. you just expect a call or a visit. And sometimes you forget that he's no longer here because it's still so fresh, and it shouldn't have happened. After Nathan died, I started working at Aboriginal Legal Service. I didn't really know how badly people were treated until Nathan had passed away, and now it's something that I hear about every day. The jail systems don't take Aboriginal lives seriously. They really don't care about our people inside jails.
Genocide began in Australia in 1788 and has never ceased. Our people become invisible within the prison system. Prisons are not places of safety, and in fact Aboriginal people deserve to be on country where we're healing, where we're safe, and where we're happy.
Very moving. I know that some of you may have had a bit of a hard time hearing that, so I will post the video in the chat as well, and you can watch it again. I encourage you to do that and to sign the petition as suggested. But to start the discussion, Carly, why does this keep happening? I think like we're the last I heard was now up to 437 deaths in custody. This has been happening for such a long time. This is certainly not the first moment that, at least in my lived experience, it's been very prominent in the national conversation, but things don't seem to have really changed. Yeah, why does this keep happening?
Thanks, Daniel. I just want to acknowledge the families of people who have lost loved ones to deaths in custody. You know, I have a platform today to be able to talk to you and to talk about the experience of the ALS, and but those families sharing their stories and having done it for decades and centuries, we really just have to acknowledge their contribution to this movement and this moment that we're in right now. I think it's fair to say, you know, no matter what we look like or where we come from, we all want to know that we can make it home to our families at the end of the day. But we know that people who are entrusted to serve and protect our communities target, detain, and even kill Aboriginal men, women, and kids. You mentioned like the statistics and where we're at with 439, I think, deaths in custody now since the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody handed down their report in 1991. And just a few weeks ago, we saw the horrible footage of a 16-year-old Aboriginal boy being assaulted in Surrey Hills. Last month, we saw the video footage of another 16-year-old Aboriginal boy being unlawfully strip searched by police in a New South Wales regional town, despite him telling them that his parents should be there. We don't need to look to America to see the consequences of systemic discrimination. You know, we see it right here. Nathan Reynolds, Rebecca Ma, TJ Hickey, David Dungay Jr., Stephen Freeman, Patrick Fisher, Tanya Day, Miss Clark, Wayne Fella Morrison, Kumanjai Walker, and so many more have been ripped from their families unnecessarily. And I think we really are getting finally some attention on the fact that these are not one-offs. This is a complete failure to address systemic racism. And it is systemic. It's being perpetrated by individuals, absolutely, but this is a systemic issue that continues to place our loved ones in danger, and it is killing them. I think you're on mute, Daniel.
Thanks. I think I think you're correct that this is a systemic problem. What needs to change?
There's a lot that needs to change, and I think like one of the things that the statistics don't necessarily highlight for people is the ways that our institutions and the power that's involved with them and the policymakers that are behind some of these institutions, if we're going to look to the same people for the solutions, we're going to end up with the same problems. We absolutely have to try different things here, you know, no matter what people are calling it, you know, from whether it's defunding police, it's shifting resources towards decarceration strategies. It's shifting resources away from people with power to people who have not had that power. You know, we need to end the imprisonment of our people. We need to make sure that our communities have easy access to income support, you know, end homelessness, strengthening justice, reinvestment approaches and place-based interventions. There are so many things that could happen in a policy setting, but I think it's so critical to remember that if we're going to have the same policymakers redesigning these settings, we will have the same problems. And it has to be like the people who are impacted who are designing these solutions. And just looping back around to that video and hearing from Michaela and Latoya, like they are the ones who are impacted. It is the families, and the families have been, you know, arguing for things like implementation of the Royal Commission recommendations since 1991 and for decades before that, of making sure, you know, that there are community-centred approaches. We have 9 coronial inquests happening at the ALS right now, and like the support that we need to be able to provide families, and those range from deaths in custodial settings, in police settings, suicides, but also one of the things that I think is often not mentioned is critical incident deaths. So, you know, think of those ones that have occurred not necessarily legally in custody, but result from a police chase, or think of poor TJ Hickey. And so without making sure that communities have got the resources to change these systems, not just at an individual level, but at the systemic level, we're not going to get the change. And I think that's what's needed.
I think you mentioned an interesting kind of thread there, which is, you know, what a lot of focus has been put on the kind of number since the Royal Commission, but what does that include? And I guess the subtext of that question is, are there actually a lot more people who've been affected either directly through deaths that may not have necessarily been under custodial care, but as a direct result of some kind of an interaction with the police, and secondarily, like, you know, are you seeing a lot of, or can you give us a sense of what you are seeing in terms of the consequences that may not result in death and may not go into that total? I imagine there's a problem that's much bigger than just people dying in custodial care specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like of the ones that we have at the moment, of course, there are deaths in corrective services facilities due to ineffective medical care. There are matters relating to police pursuit. There are matters relating to sort of unexplained circumstances. And, you know, it's not that long ago that I've heard kind of allegations of a death where people are saying, you know, that the police were involved in that. And it's one of the things that I think we have seen with no justice for any of the families who have lost people to deaths in custody is the way these things are investigated and the way Aboriginal people are listened to, and what is done about, you know, the things that they say have happened. Or like one interesting thing that, you know, I know for many people listening is going to be something that you have already thought of, but there is always a response, I think, particularly in Australia, of solidarity when there is a death, like outside of this country, from police brutality or, you know, anything sort of like that. But I think sometimes the response here is too often, well, what did they do to deserve that? I want to know what happened in the lead up to this before I will condemn what has happened to these people. And that is sadly like the underlying systemic racism that we're dealing with in this country.
I use that as an opportunity to bring you in, Larissa. So I am keen to talk a bit more about some of the broader work that you've seen happening in the sector, but on that point specifically, I think, you know, Carly's correct, and a few people in the chat have even mentioned this, that there's a real defensiveness amongst particularly Anglo/white people in Australia around institutions, and they assume they, you know, I would suggest that people typically assume that the institutions are acting responsibly. I guess you've got a lot of experience kind of calling out institutional failures. How do you navigate those conversations with people? How do you say that, you know, the police aren't necessarily always acting in a reasonable and rational way, and that there's some other layers going on?
I think that one of the important things, and it goes to the point that Carly was just making around particularly the media and just society and how we respond to these, because this has been going on for a long time. And I think one of the really defining moments in recent history that really defined how people felt that they could and would talk about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people was the Northern Territory intervention, where you had some really inflammatory and quite frankly, like untrue remarks made about Aboriginal people, these stigmas that existed, and then all of a sudden this notion kind of prevailed that we are creating the situation that we're in, and that people who are making decisions about us are making the right decisions, and for some reason we are incapable and we don't care about our communities and our families and our children. And so it changed the way that within media you would see, like, and you see this a lot, and it's been called out, especially around a lot of the kind of the breakfast programming and that sort of stuff, where they just get two completely opposing views, and this like oppositional view would just say these really racist things, and it is so pervasive into the everyday speech. You know, I'll get my hair done, and I remember the hairdresser telling me, oh, when I told him what I did, and it was like, oh yeah, Aboriginal people, they destroy their houses. Like, these stigmas and kind of misinformation and really racist ideas about us prevail. What we've seen in the last 5 years, especially around the influence of the Black Lives Matter movement, is a lot of the organisers from the US travelling into Australia and meeting with the families who have always done the bulk of it. Like, every family has a story around police brutality. But I think really over the last 5 years, in kind of this digital age, has really redefine the way that we talk about and talk about what's happening and what the government is doing and hold people to account. And so I think the idea around the Black Lives Matter movement and really filming police, and also the idea that people, you know, one of the biggest campaign messages that comes out of the kind of Black Lives Matter movement is say their names. In an Australian context with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, there's a lot of cultural norms around not talking about people who have died. So that's a big thing that a lot of families had to bridge, and like even to the point of people pushing towards coronial inquests and that sort of stuff, and pushing to release footage. And so when you're confronted with these images of brutality, then people all of a sudden, those justifications that people make, because the evidence is right there. When you look at George Floyd, it's like someone is standing on this person and this person is dying, and it's so merciless and it's so brutal that people share it because people think that this has to stop. And so you see this kind of traditional media frame kind of outpaced by people's outrage, by people's ideas that this shouldn't be happening. For a lot of people, for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we know and we expect this kind of brutality from police. We live it all the time. Like, if you have, like I have lots of nieces and nephews, and I know that when my nephews are going out downtown, we constantly remind them not to interact with police and don't do anything stupid every time they like, this is a social norm for us because we know that they will be targeted. Like the amount of times I've just had like one of my nephews, like 8 years old, and he came up to me the other day and was like running, and he's like, oh, I just saw the cops. He has so much fear within his body at that time because he understands like what has happened within our own family. And so I think in this moment, we're really seeing kind of this citizen journalism take over, and you no longer have an editor to say that this story isn't newsworthy. And so I think the way that turns into the responsibility that we have, people talk a lot about how do we persuade people around what needs to happen and that sort of stuff. And it's really incumbent on us as communicators to make sure we're not taking the kind of the middle line on things and trying to, tidy up our words. People really want our communications to speak to exactly what is happening. And I think one of the things that we've seen over the last 2 weeks, so since the election, the stuff that we've done on Black Lives Matter, we came out as a team and said, we're going to focus directly on what is happening here because it's happening in our own backyard. And we know that there's enough understanding between Black people that have travelled here, but Black and brown people, and the injustice and systemic racism, that we're not going to get called out for being like, how dare you capitalise on this moment, which people tried doing in the US. So we kind of had this thing playing out where we knew what Trump was going to say. We had an idea because we know a lot of the people in government repeat Trump's lines here. And so we went out on a frame of like, we're going to focus on Aboriginal families and the fact that there is inaction here, and put pressure on Scott Morrison and state and federal leaders, because at the end of the day, these are the people empowered to make change. And by doing that, just in terms of like GetUp's reach, this is the biggest reach that we've had post-election. Some of our interactions on posts had over 1 million reactions and stuff like a million impressions and stuff like that, which is just huge. And it talks to people actually wanting to see content that explains what's happening and explains who's at fault of this thing. And I think through that, over the week, we went from talking about families, drawing the comparisons, and also really drawing out how change can happen and who is responsible for inaction. And through that, that's what resonated with people.
That's phenomenal. And I think that's definitely true across some of the other real.
You're just breaking up, Daniel.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
I was saying, yeah, phenomenal reach, really great. And I think like it's really comforting because I think after having worked in advocacy for nearly a decade, sometimes there's moments that are really inside the tent. And then there's sometimes things that really travel. And I think this is one of them. Like, I think there's a really broad conversation happening about this at the moment. One thing just to kind of, you touched on this a little bit, but I know you also mentioned it in your very first comments as well, is you've seen a lot of work being done by a lot of different organizations. Can you give us a sense of like how organizationally you have observed First Nations organizations try to take advantage of this moment?
I think that the most important thing that has resonated is it's funny to see how people kind of get called out when they, even though this thing was kind of redefining blanket coverage with systemic racism while we have a global pandemic is insane. Like the idea that this moment could happen, and just seeing a lot of organizations and people coming out and trying to like find that really narrow line. But I think the thing that worked is that Aboriginal people you could tell where Aboriginal people were behind the communications of things. They took a very strong line. It was just like not mincing their words. I think there was just so much wealth of experience to speak to as well, that it just like anybody else who said anything differently just didn't look like they had no idea. It looked like they were completely out of touch. And I think that it was incredible to see, but there was also this thing that was happening in our media where, because of the relationships of particularly Aboriginal journalists and that sort of stuff, there was a lot of calling out of media that happened early that maybe people didn't realise. And what that allowed to happen is, while this kind of, we were building to the massive protests and that we were seeing here, all of a sudden the people who were telling the stories in the mainstream media were no longer white people talking about us. And I think that that's something that's really incredibly important, because and there are a lot of families out kind of in media and being the people that were commenting. A lot of these organisations then were given space to step forward in media. That doesn't just happen. And I think people need to understand kind of the amount of work that is done behind the scenes to shift something like that. But I was saying the other night, talking to Alison Whitaker, and I was just saying, like, I'm so proud of the amount of collaboration that happens. There's no turf, and it's just everybody understands what the bigger goal here is around protecting our communities and our families. And just there is so much collaboration that happens from an activist, from the peak organisations and that sort of stuff. Just because we know that this is, I got a text from someone who said, like, you know, I went to a philosophy class with Charlie Perkins, and this moment right now where people are calling out racism in Australia feels like, right, it just feels like that. How do we leverage this moment? And it's just like, we are in this moment, and everybody that is a black person in this country understands that we can't squander it.
We're going to go to questions in a second. We've got a couple on stack, and please drop yours in if you've got anything that's occurred to you. One person has acknowledged that it'd be great to have some resources for self-education, and a few people have already really helpfully put some useful contributions forward. I might just flag that we might collect some of the things that have come out of the chat and include it in our follow-up email afterwards, and also make that an open offer to both you, Carly and Larissa, if there's something that you guys share with people who are trying to discover or self-educate, we can include that for everyone as well. But before we go to those questions, I might just come back to you, Carly. You mentioned earlier on Michaela's story and how powerful that is, and how common or how widely shared experiences like hers are. She was, to the audience, she was intending to join us today, and it's sad that we weren't able to have her. But I was wondering if Carly, in your place, if you could share some of those personal stories of people you've worked with, that you've come across. You know, what does that lived experience look like? Because I know that's something that you know, that listeners have expressed to us, so that they've been quite surprised to discover just how different the world looks when you look at it through a First Nations person's eyes.
Yeah, thanks, Daniel. Look, it's unfortunate that Michaela couldn't be here today to talk to it, and I think I'll leave like Michaela's story to that video, because no one talks to her story obviously better than she can, and she should do that. I guess like I was talking to the journalists the other day, even about my experience as a lawyer, and one of the first pleas that I did, and that was in Victoria, in the Koori Court, and I had a 12-year-old Aboriginal boy who was in court for stealing a chocolate bar. And I often think kind of back on this, that we are dragging 12-year-olds kind of into court, into the criminal justice system for something that I'm sure many people who are joining this call would acknowledge that, you know, surely that is something that the parents can deal with at home. You know, we dragged mum out of work for the day. We dragged this young person out of school for the day. We had police prosecutors. We had a magistrate. I was there taking up resources of the Aboriginal Legal Service all because we were there because of a chocolate bar. And I think this says so much more about the system that has been designed by colonisers than it does about a hungry 12-year-old boy and the way that Aboriginal people get trapped within the quicksand of the criminal justice system because of that targeting, because of that racism, because of the colonisation. And I've reflected that that person, he later went on to be targeted by police again. It was a case of mistaken identity where, he had some serious injuries due to an arrest where they were out looking for a 40-year-old person. And it happened, like, you know, he was a, 16-year-old or so at the time. And so I just, for me, like to enter into the system as a result of a chocolate bar, be trapped there, then ultimately be targeted, I think is just such a common story, like for Aboriginal people. And sadly, you know, for a lot of people, it doesn't stop at just being a case of mistaken identity. Like, it results in people dying. And really, if we're not standing up to that right now, then we're not, what are we standing for?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I remember hearing you share that story at another point and reflecting on that a lot. I remember as a child, I also stole a chocolate bar and got in a whole bunch of what seemed like trouble, but because people read me as white, it was nothing like that. I think now I'd like to just throw it to Joe, who has a question for you both, but I might direct it to Carly to start.
Yes, hello. I'd like to say that I'm on Wadawurrung country in Victoria and acknowledge the Wadawurrung people and all other Aboriginal people. I was very interested in the Royal Commission into the Aboriginal deaths in custody 30 years ago, and in fact marched 5 years after that because nothing had been done. And it's 30 years. The commissioners did a fabulous job. They identified over 330 recommendations, and yet very, very, very few of these have been adopted. And can you tell me why? I'm often bemused by the fact that these recommendations haven't been adopted.
I'm happy to kick off, and I'm sure Larissa will jump in with some views about that. I saw, and I'm sure many of you have shared, but I saw April Day, the daughter of Yorta Yorta Elder in Victoria, who lost her mum because she, because of systemic racism. But ultimately, if a recommendation from the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody to end the charge of being found drunk in a public place had, like the Royal Commission recommended, actually been changed, so her mum would still be alive. And to say why they have not been recommended is lots of reasons, but I think it's the same reasons right now that so many other reports sit on a shelf gathering dust, because there is not the political will to implement them. There is not the leadership to implement them. And I might get Riss to jump in now.
I think the other thing to note is, and I've seen this comment in there, so I might grab it as well, but this is why the Black Lives Matter movement is so important, because what it says is that Black Lives Matter. The problem with there's nothing wrong with the recommendations. They need to be implemented. Some have, and then they've been defunded. And so there's a huge problem around needing to audit what is actually out there and the political pressure needs to be put on politicians to keep them. I was reflecting the other week that we're currently running a campaign to protect the Environmental Protection Act. This is the 7th time we've had to run this campaign. Imagine if every time they went to defund one of these Aboriginal, the recommendations out of the Royal Commission, people were angry. And so I think there's a lot about the value that we put on Aboriginal lives that really matter here. And when people talk about the reason Black Lives Matter is so good, and people talk about, well, all lives matter. And it's like, well, the rebuttal to that, I heard this thing the other day where someone was like, well, if we said all houses matter and one house was on fire, you'd look like an idiot, right? And so you need to put value around who we're talking about, and when we go to talking about Latoya and also Michaela's story, talk about April and the work that they've done, it's so important to bring stories into the media and into the mainstream that talk about who these people are in our communities. They're not just numbers. They're not just other. We need to put full lives around these people, and we need to explain how unjustified it is the way that they keep dying the way that people do. People die in custody because correctional officers do not believe Aboriginal people when they say that they're sick, and overwhelmingly Aboriginal people in custody are not given access to healthcare. That is systemic racism and racial profiling that happens. And so we need to talk about how we value and change the way that we talk about Aboriginal people in this country.
One question in the chat from Rachel Stewart, who I believe isn't able to ask it herself, but I think is kind of interesting to pose there is, are there certain areas within Australia where this is worse? Like is part of this that, like I guess I'm not sure how to articulate that beyond, like, do governments try and pass it off as, it's very difficult to resource these kind of care and support facilities in regional areas, and it just happens to be where there are where a lot of the problems are forming?
I might kick off and just say that postcode justice is a thing.
Yeah.
And we see it all the time. I do think it's important to note, that young kid being targeted a couple of weeks ago, that, can I say, would never have got the attention that it got, even a couple of months ago or a year ago, which kind of really demonstrates where we're at right now, and the potential to kind of harness this energy and attention that we really do have on Aboriginal lives. But, that happened in Surrey Hills. So I don't want to say that this doesn't happen everywhere. It does. But we see all the time that postcode justice is a thing at the ALS. And you absolutely, Mount Druitt is the highest number of fines for people. And it's also, of course, like a lower socioeconomic, the good people at Just Reinvest New South Wales have picked like particular communities because they know that postcode justice is a thing. We've got, the Marinuka project that has been set up in Burke because, of so many things. I can't emphasize enough that postcode justice thing. And yes, of course, we see things like so many regional communities have not got access to the supports that they need. At the moment, there's sort of discussions about a Wallama court and where that will be based, or do we need a drug court and does that need to be based in regional New South Wales? The thing is, we need both of those things. And too often, I think, of course, where people sit in terms of their electorate can dictate the resources that they have and the resources that they are provided. Riss?
I agree with that. I think that it's something like over 70% of the non-Indigenous population live in major cities, and 70% of our populations live in regional to remote areas. And so when you look at where the lion's share of funding goes, it goes into major city centres. And when you give people external to that only options that are digital and no face-to-face support services, and this is not in all cases, but it's a it's a complete shift in actually how that can change meaningfully the services and support and how that people access them. I think we need to actually talk about this, and this is why we need to talk about systemic racism and why we need to hold governments accountable well beyond, and we need to keep this conversation going well beyond a viral moment, because it is going to take huge shifts in the way that the government resources this country properly, the way that it prioritizes who gets funding for our communities. So often we see it sucked up into kind of national bodies with huge amounts sucked up in administration, and then the services that people actually get on the ground are minuscule or not, they're not there at all.
I think continuing this conversation beyond this moment is a great and important thing, and I think the easiest immediate next step people who are here today can do is to sign the petition that Larissa shared earlier, so that we can, and I might reshare as well as we close, to continue hearing from the ALS. And I think also once you've done that, I strongly encourage you to donate to them as well, because obviously the work they're doing is really significant and very important. I think I might now throw to another question up. So which is Sarah Ridout.
Oh, hello. Yes, I was interested in what you think the best, most effective thing allies can do to help in Australia. I mean, it's very frustrating, to feel powerless, wanting to help. And I donate and I sign all the petitions, and I just wonder which organisations are the most effective that you would recommend, that you think, and what are the most important things we can do to help?
And I might throw that to Carly and then Larissa.
Yeah, thank you. For me, of course, the most impactful people right now are the families who have lost loved ones in custody, and a number of them are obviously fundraising for incredibly important reasons in their continued fight for justice. And I would say that we absolutely need to be supporting them directly. My board would, of course, kill me if I didn't suggest that or tell you about how underfunded the ALS is and how underfunded other ATSLs are. And, I mentioned before that we've got 9 coronial inquests at the moment, but we are not resourced to support the families who have lost loved ones. We, have been sort of talking about this kind of 0 deaths in custody team and a coronial team that we need at the ALS. And I know the other ALSs around the country, have got sort of similar perspectives, because this isn't, as I said before, it's not enough for us just to support the individuals in the moment. We absolutely need, campaigners and people who can change things systemically. And it is why, people like Larissa are so important for our communities. But of course, you and I both know that there are no funding agreements that I have at the ALS that are going to provide us with the resources for a campaigner and for people to actually go out publicly to change these things systemically. And so we do these things because we're community members and we do it in our own time. But we absolutely do need your support.
Yeah, I think that for me, I think people need to interrogate where they donate money to. I think it's very easy to donate and think that you are supporting an Aboriginal cause, but you really need to interrogate whether these are Aboriginal organisations and definitely donate to families. I think, there were so many fundraisers that I've seen and people putting lists out of organisations to fund, and I was like, these are not Aboriginal organisations. There are plenty of big charity organisations that claim to do this work. They're not best placed to do this work because they don't understand our communities. They don't have the commitment. and they may have some sort of funding cycle agreement, whatever, with donors, government, it doesn't matter. But this is a long-term change. And so you need organisations that are really committed for the long term. And then, you know, Carly's organisation has been around, the Aboriginal Legal Service has been around for like 50 years. These are definitely the organisations best placed to do this work, who have been doing this work for generations. The other thing I would say on this is, in terms of taking this moment beyond a viral moment, I think you need to look at what are the kind of news outlets and the commentary that's out there that people that are talking about the families. Go back and have a look. Make sure you are subscribed to these news outlets. Make sure you are sharing these stories and this media that is going out. Make sure that you do sign petitions, whether it's First Nations Justice Team petitions from us or with ALS or Aboriginal organisations, to keep updated on what is happening and what is the action and what is needed in terms of political pressure and that sort of stuff. Because I feel like a viral moment happens and then people are not there when we actually need it, when it really counts for people to kind of go and lobby their minister. Because we have this thing, and it is around this like postcode racism and justice. And it's like, we need people where we, you know, people in major cities where people have to convince lots and lots of voters, and that's, they care more about what you think, and that's just the sad truth of it. And so if you care about, if you can actually put First Nations issues on the agenda in your political cycles and in elections in your electorates, where you are more likely to have a minister or more likely to have someone whose numbers actually count, then that really matters. Malandiri McCarthy and a lot of Aboriginal ministers and that sort of stuff can stand in Parliament and read out names and that sort of stuff, but at the end of the day, they're not making the decisions.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially when a lot of those people are not in government as well. There's been a lot of people asking for like other potential organisations as well. We might get a bit of a list together and include that in our follow-up as well. But I think that Larissa's main points there are the really important framework when I think about this stuff, which is it Indigenous controlled and Indigenous run? Is it connected to community? And also, more importantly, is it the right organisation for this work, which is definitely where my encouragement and endorsement of the ALS is coming from. If you don't know their story, you should read that on the website. But the ALS was largely created exactly for moments and issues like this. We're getting pretty close to time now. So what I might do is ask you both another kind of more personal and broader question, which is something we've also asked everybody, which is something that you're really grateful for, or something that has really brought you a lot of joy and given you a sense of hope over this week. There's plenty in the world at the moment to feel dark and down about, and indeed we've just discussed some pretty depressing stuff. Depressing because it's so significant, so consequential, and often feels so immovable. But I'm sure that you have had a win, a success, or something that has just brought you joy this week. So I'll get you to have a moment to think about that while I do some wrap-up stuff. Firstly, I'd like to also thank you both for joining us. I think you've had a lot of really interesting and useful thoughts to share, and I think people have been really grateful to engage and hear about it. I also want to thank everyone who's come and joined us today. I think we've had a really good turnout. We've had at varying times around 200 people here for this conversation, which I think is a really important one and a really great size of people to have that conversation with. So thank you for making time today to join us. Amongst those resources, the different organisations you could potentially look at, and also some different readings you might be able to do, we're going to include a feedback survey in our follow-up email. If you could let us know how you felt like today go, that's really helpful for us. Also, do have a look at some of the sessions that we'll be having on next week on Australia at Home. As I mentioned, it is our last week doing Australia at Home. So one real highlight is on Friday, we're going to have a bit of a summary and look back at everything that has gone on in the last couple of weeks, all the conversations we've had with Australia at Home. We've also got a really interesting session on healthcare, on democracy in Hong Kong, the Political Geek Fest as usual, which is a bit of a look back at the week that was, and also another really interesting conversation about how to tell the truth about Australia's Indigenous path passed on Monday. That one does already have a wait list though, so unfortunately that's going to be a bit tight, but you will be able to watch it after on Monday afternoon if you were interested. Now, just to come back to you guys, and I might start with you, Larissa, what's something that has brought you joy over the last week or so?
I think for me, this is more personal, but was so kind of engrossed in doing the work around just all the media, all the comms, supporting organisers and stuff like that around rallies. And there was a point of kind of looking back at my family did a big protest. We lost two of our big brothers in custody about 15 years ago. And another family member who was part of the original Royal Commission inquest. And so I feel like in our families, there's this kind of really just defeated and, people are really hurt. And so one of the things was just kind of like looking back through social media comms and that sort of stuff at home and just seeing so many of like my nieces and nephews commenting. And even like they drove down to Sydney, even though at that time the rally was illegal, and just like, my nieces and nephews that never met our big brothers and stuff like that, and had, created these big posters and that sort of stuff with their photos on it. And that was really an incredible invigoration to see within my own family.
That's wonderful. What about you, Carly?
Yeah, mine's probably somewhat personal as well. And no one's allowed to tell my grandmother about this, but my nan is not Aboriginal. It was, it's her husband essentially is my lineage. And it's fair to say that I have had some very confronting conversations with my nan over time, and particularly about sort of racism and things like that. And I was actually with her sort of a week or so ago, and it was when all the protests were happening. And, I just actually got to have a conversation with her kind of about what it was like for my grandfather. And he, just these experiences of, going into pubs and, not being served. And he was lighter than some of his brothers as well, in terms of skin. And so there were times that they would go into a bar and he would be allowed to stay and get served. And, his brothers would be asked to leave. And just of that staunchness that existed within my family that, I can really relate to, has been some of the great things that I am grateful for at this time. But also two other things which have also had an impact on me. And one is just seeing people turn up, like stand up, turn out at these protests has just been incredible. And then I think for those people, who weren't able to physically turn up for whatever reason, I occasionally do the thing that you should never do, is read the comments, online, and seeing people just defending like Aboriginal people and fighting the racists has just been incredible.
Yeah, I have to admit, like that's something. If I can also offer positive, I absolutely found that invigorating as well. It's it's been a really challenging time for all of us for a whole bunch of different reasons, but it's just been so amazing to see. Yeah, as I kind of alluded to before, just like a genuine groundswell of support. Like even just on a measure like the sheer volume of traffic that we've also seen go to the ALS website is an enormous growth. And just kind of great to know people are still looking to care for each other, despite the fact we've kind of all felt a bit separated from each other. Great. Well, I know we're mindful that we're a few moments over time. I think it was worth it, but I don't want to take up any more of your Friday afternoon, so I might leave it there. So again, thank you so much to both Carly and Larissa. I think it's a fantastic conversation, and I really echo Jenny Loverick's comment, which is thank you both. Strong women like you are really inspiring. I also want to thank again everyone who joined us, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon and a really great weekend. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.